There is a question that the global fashion industry has spent centuries ignoring. The question is this: where did the ideas actually come from? Where did the patterns, the textiles, the techniques, the silhouettes, the embroidery, the dyes, the vocabulary of global fashion actually originate? Because the answer, and when traced honestly through trade records and colonial inventories and textile history and linguistic etymology, points to the same place: India. India is where some of the world's most important clothing traditions began. Long before Europe became known for fashion, India was already producing some of the finest textiles on earth. For thousands of years, Indian weavers, dyers, and artisans perfected techniques that amazed traders from around the world. Even today, many of these centuries-old Indian crafts continue to inspire and power the global luxury fashion industry. Yet while these designs and techniques appear in high-end collections across the world, they are often presented without mentioning the country and artisans who created them. Let's trace some of the world's most iconic luxury products back to where they really began: India. This is what that history actually looks like: the words that were taken. Before Western brands took India's techniques, they took India's words, stripping them of their geography and their meaning, and folding them into a global fashion vocabulary that no longer remembers where they came from. Paisley is perhaps the most widely recognized example. The teardrop-shaped motif with a curved tail appears on everything from Valentino scarves to Gucci wallpaper to the ties of investment bankers who would not recognize the word botte. Botte is the original name for the pattern. The motif appears in Indian textiles from at least the Sasanian period and was a central element of Kashmiri pashmina shawls for centuries before European trade routes brought those shawls to Britain. The Scottish town of Paisley began mass-producing imitation versions of Kashmiri shawls in the early 19th century because the originals were too expensive for most consumers. The imitation became so popular that the pattern was renamed after the Scottish town. The Kashmiri original has spent 200 years being called by the name of a place that copied it. Kashmir tells a similar story. The word itself is an anglicization of Kashmir, the region in northern India where pashmina wool, produced from the underbelly of the Changhangi goat at altitudes above 14,000 feet, was first woven into the extraordinarily fine fabric that European aristocrats were willing to pay fortunes for. When European manufacturers began producing their own version of the fabric using sheep's wool, they kept the name. Today, mass-market cashmere can be made from any soft wool anywhere in the world, and the word no longer implies the specific fiber or the specific geography of its origin. Cashmere gave its name to a material it no longer controls the definition of. Calico is a cotton fabric named after the Indian city of Calicut, now Kozhikode, in Kerala, from which it was first exported to European markets by traders in the 16th century. It became one of the most traded textiles in the world, drove the Industrial Revolution in Britain, and is now a staple fabric of craft projects in art schools across the Western world, with almost no one aware that its name comes from a city on the Malabar coast. Another example being Chintz, from the Hindi word chint, meaning splashed or spattered, was the vibrant glazed printed cotton that became so fashionable in 17th century Europe that both France and England passed laws banning its import to protect their own textile industries from Indian competition. The fabric was that good. The banning of Indian chintz is one of the earliest recorded examples of protectionist trade policy driven specifically by Indian commercial superiority. Then we have Dungaree, which comes from Dungaree, a neighborhood in Mumbai, where a coarse cotton fabric used to make workwear was produced and sold. Pajama is an anglicization of the Persian and Urdu pajama, meaning leg garment, which entered English usage through British colonists who observed the clothing in India and brought the concept back as sleepwear. Shawl comes from the Persian shawl, used to describe the fine Kashmiri wool wraps that the Mughal court wore, and that European nobility subsequently coveted. Kumarband is from the Persian kamarband, a sash tied at the waist, adopted into British formal dress, and now considered a piece of Western evening wear so traditional that most people who wear it to black tie events do not know it has a name derived from Urdu. These are not coincidences or incidental etymological curiosities. They are a documented pattern of extraction. India's textile vocabulary entered the English language through trade, through colonialism, and through the sheer commercial dominance of Indian cloth. And when it arrived, it stayed. But the geography and the culture that produced it were quietly detached from the terminology. The words remained. The acknowledgement did not. The fabric that built the global economy. Before the Industrial Revolution, India was the world's largest textile producer and exporter. At the beginning of the 18th century, India accounted for approximately 25% of global gross domestic product. A significant portion of that wealth was built on cloth. Indian cotton, particularly from the regions of Bengal, Gujarat, and the Coromandel coast, was the most sought-after textile in global markets. Not because it was cheap, because it was superior. The spinning and weaving techniques developed over centuries in Indian workshops produced cloth of a fineness that European manufacturers could not replicate. A specific Bengali muslin called woven air, Dhaka muslin or Dhakai muslin, was so fine that a full sari of it could be folded and slipped through a finger ring. A bolt of the finest Dhaka muslin could be rolled into a bundle small enough to fit inside a matchbox. These were not embellishments. They were technical achievements of a kind that the mechanized textile industry has never fully matched. The European response to Indian textile superiority was not to study it or learn from it. It was to control it. The British East India Company spent the 18th century systematically dismantling India's textile industry through a combination of trade policy, colonial legislation, and, most brutally, direct physical harm to the artisans themselves. There are documented accounts, contested by some historians but recorded in multiple sources, of weavers in Bengal having their thumbs cut off to prevent them from continuing to work. Whether or not those specific accounts reflect universal practice, the broader destruction of the Bengali weaving industry is historical fact. Dhaka muslin, which had been produced in the region for centuries and which supplied markets across the world, was functionally eliminated as a commercial product by the end of the 19th century, reduced from a globally traded luxury to a local craft on the verge of extinction. The Industrial Revolution changed the global textile industry, but much of that change came at India's expense. For centuries, India had produced some of the world's finest hand-woven fabrics. As British factories began making textiles by machine, they needed a way to replace Indian cloth in global markets. At the same time, Indian farmers were forced to grow indigo, the natural blue dye that Europe desperately wanted. Under British rule, many farmers had little choice but to cultivate indigo instead of food crops and were paid far below its true value. The profits went to British companies and investors, while the people who grew the crop remained poor. This exploitation eventually led to the Indigo Revolt of 1859, one of the earliest farmer uprisings against colonial rule. This wasn't just about textiles. It became a model for colonial trade. India produced the raw materials. Indian artisans created the knowledge and craftsmanship, but the wealth and recognition flowed elsewhere. That story didn't end with colonialism. Even today, Indian textiles, weaving techniques, embroidery, and traditional designs continue to inspire luxury fashion around the world. Yet many of these collections are presented without acknowledging the Indian artisans and traditions that inspired them. The difference today is that, in the age of the internet, people are beginning to recognize these origins and give credit where it is due. The Kolhapuri case. In 2025 at Milan Fashion Week, Prada presented a collection that included flat leather sandals described in the brand's press materials as a reimagined summer silhouette. The sandals featured the distinctive braiding, leather tooling, and sole construction of the Kolhapuri chappal, a handcrafted leather slipper with origins in the Kolhapur region of Maharashtra, India, and a documented history extending back to at least the 12th or 13th century. The footwear has a geographical indication tag in India, registered in 2019, which formally recognizes it as a product of specific regional and artisanal heritage. Prada's sandals had no geographical indication. They had no acknowledgement of Indian origin. They were presented as original design and at the price points of an Italian luxury house. The backlash from Indian designers, artisanal manufacturers, and cultural commentators was immediate and substantial. Indian craft associations wrote to the brand. Social media in India and across the South Asian diaspora documented the similarity with the kind of side-by-side visual comparison that is impossible to argue with. The story reached international fashion media. At first, Prada said the design was original, but after facing strong criticism for about a week, the company sent a letter to an Indian trade association acknowledging that the sandals were inspired by traditional Indian footwear. Prada also expressed interest in working with Indian artisans in the future. However, the company stopped short of admitting that its original claim had been misleading. For many people, the response felt like the smallest concession it could make after the backlash became impossible to ignore. The Kolhapuri case was just the latest example. This has been happening for decades. Indian crafts are copied, renamed, and sold around the world, while the people who created them are often forgotten. The techniques that got renamed. In 2017, Swedish fashion label Totem launched a collection of patterned scarves presented as part of what the brand described as a Nordic artisanal aesthetic. Indian fashion commentators and textile historians identified the pattern immediately as Bandhani, a tie-dye technique originating in Gujarat in Rajasthan, with documented practice dating back over 4,000 years. The word Bandhani itself comes from the Sanskrit bandhana, meaning binding, which is the structural essence of the technique. Each point of color is created by individually tying a tiny portion of the fabric before dyeing, a process so labor-intensive that a single Bandhani dupatta can contain tens of thousands of individually tied knots. The story doesn't end there. Rajasthan's famous Bagru and Sanganer block printing traditions have also inspired countless international fashion and home decor collections. These hand-carved wooden block prints, perfected over centuries, are often marketed simply as artisan prints or natural dye collections, with little or no acknowledgement that the technique comes from India. A similar story can be seen with Ikat. India has produced some of the world's oldest Ikat textiles, including the famous Patola of Gujarat and Sambapuri Ikat of Odisha. Yet when similar patterns appear in global fashion collections, they are usually described as simply Ikat, or geometric prints, while India's long history with the craft is rarely mentioned. Even Phulkari, Punjab's centuries-old embroidery tradition, known for its vibrant floral patterns, has followed the same path. International brands have showcased similar embroidery under labels such as folk-inspired embroidery, celebrating the design while leaving out the place and people who created it. The pattern is always the same. The craftsmanship is Indian. The techniques are Indian. The inspiration is Indian. But by the time these products reach luxury stores around the world, the Indian names, the history, and the artisans behind them have quietly disappeared. The designs become global. The credit does not. GI tags, what they protect and what they cannot. India's system of geographical indication tags, legally registered protections that tie specific products to their place of origin, similar to the protections that cover champagne, Parmigiano Reggiano, and Scotch whiskey in their respective countries, covers hundreds of Indian products. The GY tag for Kolhapuri chappals was registered in 2019. The GE tag for Darjeeling tea has been in place since 2004, making it the first Indian product to receive GI protection and one of the first in the world. Banarasi Silk, Kanchipuram Silk, Mysore Silk, Pochampally Ikat, Channapatna Toys, Korg Orange, Bikaneri Bhuja. The list of Indian products with formal GI recognition runs to several hundred entries across textiles, foods, and handicrafts. These protections matter. They provide legal standing for Indian producers when their specific name products are imitated under the same name. If a European brand tried to sell fabric labeled Banarasi Silk that was not made in Varanasi using traditional techniques, the GI framework provides the basis for a legal challenge. But GI protection has a fundamental limitation that the Kolhapuri case illustrated with precision. It protects the name. It does not protect the design. A sandal that is visually and structurally identical to a Kolhapuri chappal, made using the same techniques and materials, can be sold without consequence under any other name, as long as it is not called a Kolhapuri chappal. The physical knowledge, the design tradition, the craft heritage, none of that is within the scope of what a GI tag covers. This is the gap through which most fashion appropriation passes. The Scandinavian label does not need to call its scarves Bandhani. The Italian house does not need to label its sandals Colapuri. The American brand does not need to write Phulkari on its embroidered jacket. It simply needs to not use the Indian name. The design can be identical. The technique can be traceable. The heritage can be obvious to anyone who knows it. But without the name, the GI protection is irrelevant. The international legal framework for protecting traditional knowledge and traditional cultural expressions is far weaker than the framework for protecting commercial intellectual property. A fashion brand that spends millions developing a logo or a pattern can register it as a trademark and pursue legal action against imitators globally. A community of artisans that has developed a weaving technique over centuries has no comparable international protection for that knowledge. The asymmetry is not accidental. The intellectual property system was designed by and for the commercial interests that have historically held most of the commercial power. India's artisanal heritage, which predates the existence of that system by millennia, fits poorly within its categories. The solution being discussed by Indian policymakers, legal scholars, and artisanal trade groups involves a combination of expanded GI coverage, design registration for specific craft motifs, mandatory disclosure requirements in trade agreements, and bilateral diplomatic engagement with the European Union to extend more comprehensive protection to Indian traditional knowledge within EU trade law. These are important and necessary measures. They are also slow, complex, and contested at every level by commercial interests that benefit from the current framework. The Kolhapuri artisan whose design appeared on a Milan runway in 2025 is not waiting for international trade law reform. The pace of fashion is faster than the pace of legal protection. India is reclaiming the frame. India's fashion story is not only a story of what has been taken, it is increasingly a story of what is being reclaimed by Indian designers, Indian brands, and an Indian consumer class that has stopped looking to Europe for the definition of luxury and started looking at what India has been making for centuries. Sabyasachi Mukherjee has built one of the most recognized luxury fashion brands in the world without moving the brand to Paris, without reframing Indian aesthetics for Western approval, and without compromising the traditional techniques at the center of his work. His Banarasi silks, his Zardosi embroidery, his Bengal weaves presented in their full cultural context, without dilution, without the apologetic minimalism that had sometimes characterized Indian luxury fashion's attempts to reach global audiences, have commanded prices that rival European luxury houses and a waiting list that includes clients from across the world. The message is explicit in his work. India's textile heritage is not something that needs to be made more palatable for a Western market. It is the standard against which luxury should be measured. The shift extends beyond individual designers. India's domestic luxury fashion market has grown substantially in the past decade, driven by a generation of Indian consumers who have developed both the economic power and the cultural confidence to invest in Indian craft at premium price points. The business model that previously assumed Indian consumers wanted Western luxury brands and Indian artisanal products had to be cheap is no longer the only business model available. An Indian woman who is willing to spend 50,000 rupees on a Sabyasachi lehenga is making a statement about value that is inseparable from a statement about culture. She is asserting that Indian craft at Indian prices, carrying Indian stories, is worth as much as anything that comes in a box from Paris. The global South Asian diaspora has become a significant commercial and cultural force in the conversation. Social media creators of South Asian heritage have developed large audiences explicitly around the documentation and celebration of Indian craft and textile traditions. Building communities around Banarasi weaving, Kanjivaram silk, Lucknow embroidery, and regional craft traditions that had been undervalued or unknown outside their origin communities. When the Scandinavian scarf incident went viral, it was South Asian creators who produced the fastest and most devastating counter-narrative. Women holding up their own dupattas, their own Bandhani fabrics, their own grandmother's textiles, and narrating them with the language of luxury that had been denied them when the same objects were framed as Indian and applied when the same objects were framed as Nordic. This is the counter-argument that no brand communication strategy can fully absorb. The people who have been told for decades that their traditional clothing is too cultural, too ethnic, too much for the office, for the school, for the spaces they were trying to enter, are the same people who have been watching those same items get repackaged as premium product the moment a Western framework is applied to them. The anger that generates is not petty. It is the accumulated experience of a double standard with a very long history. India's fashion industry is also beginning to build the institutional infrastructure to match the quality of its craft with the sophistication of its commercial positioning. New luxury fashion brands are emerging that position Indian textiles not as ethnic alternatives to Western fashion, but as the primary category, the thing against which everything else is measured. Indian fashion weeks are attracting international buyers and press with increasing seriousness. Indian textile craft is being formally documented, archived, and promoted through government and private initiatives that aim to build the kind of provenance narrative that Western luxury brands have always used to justify their prices. What credit, compensation, and collaboration actually look like. The minimum standard being asked for by Indian artisanal communities, cultural organizations, and fashion industry advocates is not complicated. It is attribution, the same principle that the fashion industry applies without hesitation to its own designers, its own creative directors, its own brand narratives. When a garment contains Bandhani work from Gujarat, the name Bandhani should appear alongside the brand name. When a shoe is made using Kolhapuri techniques, the technique should be named. When embroidery was produced by specific artisans in a specific atelier in Lucknow, those artisans should be named, not as a marketing note, but as the same kind of essential provenance information that tells a consumer where their wine was grown, where their cheese was made, where their coffee was sourced. Beyond attribution, the conversations that are beginning to happen between Indian artisanal communities and international fashion houses are increasingly focused on compensation models that reflect the actual value of the skills being employed. The current system, in which Indian embroidery work that takes 40 hours to complete is compensated at rates that represent a fraction of a percent of the garment's retail value, is neither ethically defensible nor commercially sustainable in an environment where consumers are increasingly aware of supply chain realities. The brands that have begun acknowledging their Indian supply chains are discovering, almost without exception, that the acknowledgement increases rather than decreases consumer trust. Collaboration, genuine collaboration, in which Indian craft practitioners are involved in design conversations rather than simply executing design briefs from European studios, is the more ambitious model. It requires a different kind of relationship between European houses and Indian workshops, one in which the Indian artisan's knowledge is treated as a form of intellectual contribution rather than a form of labor input. When that happens, the resulting work tends to be more interesting, more distinctive, and more commercially durable than work produced through the standard extraction model. The Chanakya partnership, for all its limitations, demonstrated this at scale. The instances where it has worked best are the instances where the Indian knowledge holder's role was genuinely creative, not merely technical. The question of whether these changes happen slowly through market pressure and consumer consciousness, or faster through formal legal mechanisms and diplomatic trade agreements, is a practical one with significant implications. The artisans who are being undercredited and undercompensated now are not abstractions. They are specific people, practicing specific skills in specific communities that have maintained those skills across generations. The continued economic marginalization of artisanal craft communities in India, a marginalization that is substantially driven by the same global fashion industry that profits from their techniques, has real consequences for whether those techniques survive at all. The narrative that the global fashion industry has told itself for decades and has successfully transmitted to consumers worldwide is that fashion's highest expression originates in Paris, in Milan, in New York, that the standard of luxury is a European standard, that the history of significant textile and craft innovation is fundamentally a Western history, with occasional exotic contributions from the rest of the world that function as inspiration material for the designers who actually do the creative work. That narrative has always been false. India was producing the finest cotton on earth before Britain industrialized. India was supplying the global dye trade before German chemistry replaced Indian indigo with synthetic alternatives. India's embroidery traditions were supplying Mughal courts with work of a complexity and beauty that no European equivalent matched before the East India Company decided that Indian textile competition was a threat to be eliminated rather than a tradition to be respected. India has been giving the global fashion industry its vocabulary, its techniques, its materials, and its artisanal backbone for centuries. The industry has been accepting all of it while attributing most of it to somewhere else. What is changing now is not India's contribution. That contribution has been constant. What is changing is India's willingness to accept the erasure of it, and the technological and cultural infrastructure that makes the erasure harder to sustain. When a Prada sandal can be placed side by side with a Kolhapuri chapel in a social media post, and the comparison shared 1 million times before the brand's PR department has finished drafting a response, the economics of attribution have shifted. When South Asian creators with large global audiences can document Bandhani technique in Gujarat and place it directly next to a Swedish brand's campaign claiming the same pattern as Nordic artisanal, the story tells itself. India is not the next big trend in fashion. India is not a source of inspiration that the industry has recently discovered. India is the civilization that built the foundation on which much of global fashion stands, and is now, for the first time in modern history, in a position to say so with the economic power, the cultural confidence, and the global audience to make that statement impossible to ignore.